d'introduire maintenant comme premier intervenant pour cette semaine Roland Chauville, hein, qui est le fondateur et le directeur de UPR-info. UPR-info est l'organisation dont on a déjà eu l'occasion de parler hier dans les groupes linguistiques. C'est l'organisation dont il faut avoir le site web ouvert en permanence sur son ordinateur quand on travaille sur les PU et quand on prépare les différentes sessions. C'est un organisme absolument central dans la coordination de l'action des ONG par rapport à l'EPU. Alors, je ne vais pas prendre plus de temps. Je remercie vraiment Roland d'être d'abord un fidèle de nos formations et d'être venu ce matin pour nous présenter justement ces questions de défis, de situation où on en est de l'EPU et les défis que l'on doit affronter. Je lui présente encore aussi nos excuses pour le retard. Il a fait un effort pour venir bien à l'heure. Et là, malheureusement, c'est nous qui n'avons pas réussi à suivre pour des raisons techniques. Roland, à toi la parole. Et encore une fois, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous.
Merci Yves. C'est toujours un plaisir de participer à ces formations. Ça doit être la 3-4e, je crois, pour moi. Je vais parler en anglais, donc voilà, pour tous les francophones, je m'excuse. C'est une question d'équilibre. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with you and to present you the challenges, also a little bit about the achievements of the UPR, but also I will also obviously speak about the challenges. So Yves made an introduction about our organization. We are, our mandate is to support civil society engagement in the UPR process, so we're here for that. We have a website, but we also organize meetings in Geneva between NGOs and permanent missions, and we also, that's a new development for us. In the future, we'll be supporting civil society work on the implementation of recommendations in countries. At the end of the PowerPoint, I show my contact details, and can also obviously come to me, and we can speak and exchange contact details. And I'm sorry, I am sick, so my voice is a bit funny. So I will look at achievements and challenges from different perspectives at the international level and at the national level, because I think the UPR has pros and cons at different levels. First, maybe as an introduction, I'd like to speak about those recommendations that are the main outcome of the UPR process in Geneva, obviously, and to show you the number of recommendations that are being that states have received in the first cycle, and that's the first line, and then in the second cycle. So we see that the darker it is, the more recommendation states have received, and obviously in the second cycle there's a lot more of dark countries, which means that countries are receiving more and more recommendations, and the ones with the white countries with dots means that they haven't been reviewed yet. So we see that more and more recommendations are being made at the UPR, and this graph shows it in terms of the average number of recommendations received by states. Now we're reaching 200 and 180. So to show you the evolution of the Geneva process, where more and more recommendations are made and therefore received by states under review. Now looking at the achievements, on which I will go more quickly than the challenges. First, at the international level, so what has the UPR achieved in terms of maybe human rights in a broader perspective than only in countries? It's first the universality of countries and issues. Countries in the sense that all countries have been participating in the UPR, have been reviewed at the UPR, and now we're in the second cycle, so states are being reviewed for a second time. We are midway through the second cycle, and all states have been reviewed entirely through the first cycle, and now half of the countries have been also voluntarily reviewed. And in terms of issues, at the UPR, any issues can be raised from new rights, let's say, or new focus, such as the right of the elderly, which is very, very new issue. Business and human rights, which is not new, but it's, let's say, more raised. Also, statelessness, which is also an issue that is gathering attention of countries, of states, but also, I guess, of NGOs that are pushing for it. And, let's say, more old human rights, at least in terms of being the focus of the international community, such as torture, death penalty, etc. The UPR has also managed to put human rights at the forefront at the international level. Human rights is one of the 3 key pillars of the UN, yet it gets really less attention than peace and security and development, and the UPR has managed to do that, to make human rights a bit more prominent at the UN, but also among countries where states have to review each other and look into the human rights situation in each other's countries. And then the third one is complementarity with other human rights mechanisms, such as treaty bodies and special procedures, where we see that when a country is being reviewed at the UPR, we see an increase in number of standing invitation of special rapporteurs and access to ratification to conventions and treaties. Now at the national level, which is for you probably more interesting, UPR has managed to create, in a lot of countries, maybe not in all countries, it has managed to create dialogue between, or it has created the space for dialogue at least, between governments and civil society, where a state is supposed to consult its civil society before being reviewed in Geneva. And civil society has seen an opportunity to talk human rights with their governments, and have this legitimacy to speak about human rights with the governments. Among NGOs as well, due to the universality in terms of issues at the UPR, NGOs that usually would not work together because they work on different issues, they would then come together, sit down and try to write a report that will represent the concerns of the overall civil society in the country. So that has increased the dialogue among civil society in countries. And then the national level, the implementation, we are publishing a study next week that looks into the implementation of over 11,000 recommendations based on information received by governments, UN agencies and NGOs, and where we see that on those 11,000 recommendations, roughly 48% of them, 3 years after the review, had triggered some action from the government. So which is an encouraging figure showing, and we have concrete cases of examples of advancements in human rights. But this is to show that the UPR is triggering action by governments and is really helping in pushing forward the human rights agenda in countries. So this 48% it's a figure, so it has to be taken into with caution, but it's a figure that shows that the UPR has this capacity to get the ball rolling on human rights in countries. And in more details, this is quite interesting. Recommendations at the UPR can be accepted and noted by the governments. And we see that recommendations that are noted still sometimes get implemented. And why? Because states change their position. At one point they cannot accept a recommendation, and then this political situation changes, so they're able to actually accept it at the end, etc., etc. So states can also under pressure from civil society. For example, in Canada, they did not accept to recognize the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then with time, with the pressure from different actors, including civil society, the government said, okay, we will actually recognize this declaration. So we've seen that because a recommendation is noted at some point doesn't mean it cannot be discussed first and then also accepted and implemented by government. So this is a positive note. And then that's something more technical. It's about the specificity of recommendations. The more specific recommendations are, the less accepted they are. And it's a category. So category 3 and category 5 is the more specific. So the more specific a recommendation is, you can see only half of them get accepted. But also recommendations starting with to consider ratifying this convention is also not so much accepted. But I'll go quickly on that. Now, looking at the challenges of the UPR process. Again, I'm going to look at the international level and at the national level. So first, at the international level, the specificity of recommendations, and I will go into that. Second, the lack of link between cycles, and I will go into that. No follow-up mechanism, and persistent non-cooperation. So first, the specificity. As I said, and I showed that earlier, we split recommendations in 5 categories, from less specific to most specific, depending on the actions they contain. It's a way of looking into the recommendations that countries receive, because now there's been 35,000 recommendations made at the UPR. States receive about 200 recommendations, so it's important to be able to look through those recommendations and to try to see what's useful, what's less useful, etc., etc. And what we've seen is that only 35% of recommendations are specific, which means that they contain a concrete action. So actions are mostly legal: ratify, amend the criminal code, pass this law, etc., etc. Or it can also be concrete measures such as launch an awareness-raising campaign on female genital mutilation, increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility, create a national institution for human rights, etc., etc. So those are specific actions. So only 35% are specific. The rest call on to continue to do something, to consider doing something, to take measures without saying which ones, etc., etc. And what we've seen is that from the first cycle to the second cycle, the number of specifics, so the yellow part, is diminishing. So we have less recommendation specific in the second cycle. And we believe that first for the country under review to know what to do, but also when to implementing a recommendation, it has an effect, a concrete effect, because if you implement a recommendation that calls on to continue to do something, then the government didn't take any new action. Or if you accept a recommendation to improve women's rights, and then you just appoint a new female minister, the country under review can say, well, we improved women's rights, but effectively it didn't